World in Action presents The Pirates. This is an old-fashioned pirate 17th century version. And this, a new mod-type 20th century version. This is a 17th century pirate ship, and this is their ammunition. This is a 20th century pirate ship, and this is their ammunition. For the past 6 weeks, a pirate radio ship has been transmitting pop music for 12 hours each day to the southeast of England. At 6 o'clock this morning, a second ship came on the air. The pirate ships are causing the Postmaster General a lot of trouble. This is the Postmaster General, the Right Honourable Reginald Bevins, MP.
I suppose there's always a whiff of buccaneering and adventure about this sort of thing. And most English people, of course, have got a sneaking weakness for piracy in any form. And, of course, I recognise as well as anybody that this kind of thing makes news. But I do think we ought to take a pretty cool look at the facts that surround all this business.
And that's exactly what we intend to do in tonight's World in Action. As things are now, it's only the strictly non-commercial BBC who can broadcast radio programs in Britain. The British people, of course, are perfectly at liberty to tune into any other European stations that they feel like. That, of course, includes Radio Luxembourg, which is a strictly commercial organization. Geoffrey Everett is General Manager of Radio Luxembourg in Britain.
Now, the precise difference between an operation such as Radio Luxembourg's and the pirate radio ships is simply this, that Radio Luxembourg on 208 meters are operating on a frequency which has been officially allocated to them by the international body responsible for wavelengths.
To escape the law, a pirate ship has to do two things. She has to be registered in a foreign country, not bound by international radio regulations, and she has to anchor outside British waters. Radio Caroline, 4.5 miles off Felixstowe, was the first of the pirate ships to beam unlicensed pop music over British shores.
We found the men behind this scheme in the office of that glossy magazine, Queen, just around the corner from the law courts. Jocelyn Stevens, editor-in-chief of Queen magazine, is joint managing director with 23-year-old Irishman Ronan O'Rahilly of the company which sells advertising time for Radio Caroline. Chris Moore is the program controller of Radio Caroline, and Ian Ross, sales executive. Ronan O'Rahilly, the originator of Radio Caroline, begins at the beginning.
The Dutch people were responsible for the picking of the vessel to make sure it was. There are a lot of requirements, as you can imagine, that it has to stand up to certain gale forces off the coast during the winter. Then the ship was brought to Greenore. We got complete cooperation over there in Ireland. My father is in the shipping business across channel from Greenore to Preston. He took the port over from the British Railways. It became derelict about 15 years ago, I think it was. And he said to us that we wanted a port that was quiet. Greenore is very quiet. It's hardly ever used. There's very few people around. And we wanted a place that was quiet, so there wouldn't be... We wanted it to be a surprise. We wanted the launching of Caroline to be a surprise, you see? We brought all the British technicians over, and they did the work there under complete sort of cloak and dagger arrangements. It began to get a little difficult when this 168-foot mast was erected.
The interesting thing was that Caroline arrived at off Harwich at 6 p.m. on the Good Friday, which was almost exactly 6 months after the operation really got underway, and put out a test signal at 9 p.m. that night.
On Easter Saturday, March the 28th, Radio Caroline's first broadcast descended on Britain like a bolt from the blue. It had been a well-kept secret. But there was another surprise to come. A second pirate radio ship with a different group of backers was nearing completion. This was Radio Atlanta.
Alan Crawford, 42-year-old Australian music publisher, is the boss behind this outfit. On his board of directors, you'll find such important citizens as Oliver Smedley, well-known liberal and businessman with interests in city press newspapers. Major G.C. Lomax, publisher and Lloyd's underwriter. And F.B. Broadrib, financial director to a well-known company.
You are mine. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The ship on which the Radio Atlanta group pinned their hopes was now in Greenore, the harbour owned by Ronan O'Reilly's father. In great secrecy, we were taken to this port just beneath the mountains of Mourne and 60 miles north of Dublin.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Onward, drove the 600. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Down the valley on horses they thundered. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, but was it them who really thundered? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
It was the man Fred.
The 270-ton Mi Amigo is the ship carrying Radio Atlanta. Built in 1921 in Germany, she was used as a coaster until 1961, when a film producer and a Texan millionaire ran her as one of the first pirate radio ships off the coast of Sweden. But in May 1962, the Swedish Parliament said no, and Radio Norr was rudely silenced.
Now, 2 years later, she's been fitted out for the same piratical job, this time off Britain. There are 8 in the crew, 2 Dutch deckhands, Lane and Jaab, a Polish cook who just escaped from behind the Iron Curtain, another ex-Pole who was chief engineer, a Dutch second engineer called Tony, a radio technician known as Texas, who came from Dallas, a chief mate from Holland, and Mark Odowski, the captain, who was a British naturalized Pole. When we arrived at Greenore, the Mi Amigo and her crew had already been there 5 weeks. Recent events at Greenore had begun to put a strain on the relationship between the rival pirate groups Caroline and Atlanta. Patrick Shields, O'Reilly's foreman at Greenore, explains.
Oh, the Caroline was here first, you see. The Mi Amigo lay outside, you see, and she went out. Because we couldn't have 3 ships in the dock at the same time, you see. As a matter of fact, she was anchored outside the Mi Amigo, and she dragged our anchor. What I mean, and she was up on a sandbank. Got her off the sandbank again, all right, on a high tide. Decided to take her in, so they took her in and anchored her in the dock here. Well, it's a good port, you see, and you could get them fitted out here.
The Radio Atlanta group weren't quite so enthusiastic about Greenore. Alan Crawford.
Oh, yes, it took a great deal longer than we had hoped, because there's always a certain anxiety in getting a project like this underway. And I think we merely ran into the happy Irish-go-lucky way of life there, that's all.
And Captain Odowski.
Although I was told we should be there a few days, it lasted nearly 6 weeks. I was staying in Greenore. I had my fill of difficulties there. Actually, it was the most difficult part of my trip, staying in Greenore.
Jocelyn Stevens of Radio Caroline replies.
Well, they're just being crybabies, you know, but they've been 4.5 years trying to get going, apparently. And their boat arrived in Greenore way after the Caroline was there.
Crawford has indeed been on this project for 4.5 years. Some newspapers have suggested that he had the idea first, and that O'Reilly jumped in ahead of him. Crawford puts it this way.
Oh, I met Ronan O'Reilly at the beginning of last year, 1963. We've both given each other a great deal of advice. It could be that I took less of his than he of mine.
Ronan O'Reilly puts it this way.
I knew Alan because one of the people who had been, you find out when you start on an operation. The first place I went to was Sweden, in fact. The first place I ever went to was Sweden. And you find out by going around various people who've been trying to do this. I mean, there have been a number of groups in England who've tried to put commercial radio into operation on this basis.
There can be no copyright on this idea. I mean, there have been 11 commercial radio stations on ships before. And it's idiotic to think that it's any single person's idea. It's not an invention. This is a fact. What happens is that Ronan took this fact and put it into operation.
On April the 17th, 4 weeks after the Caroline set sail, the Mi Amigo slipped away from Greenore. Officially, her destination was El Perol in Spain. The captain's bosses would reveal the true destination later. No chances were taken. The Mi Amigo was to stay outside British territorial waters for the entire voyage. No contact was to be made with any shore radio station. Every precaution was taken to ensure that Mi Amigo's position and destination remained a secret. As she set out to cross the Irish Sea with a World in Action crew aboard, the Radio Caroline backers were anxiously waiting in London to see where the Mi Amigo would eventually end up. Would she go after their listeners in the southeast area, or would she anchor somewhere off the north?
But this was only one of their worries. Official opposition was beginning to harden. Roy Mason, Labour MP for Barnsley, questioned Mr. Bevan several times in the House of Commons about pirate radio ships.
The vacillation of Her Majesty's government has now allowed Radio Caroline to become established, is now allowing Radio Atlanta to start her test transmissions. An audience is being built up. They will be, to some extent, annoyed, and consequently the government are building up trouble for themselves.
The Postmaster General had already replied in the House that he was awaiting the Council of Europe's decision on the best way to legislate against the pirates. He spoke of the action he was taking through the advertisers. Mr. Bevans explained to World in Action.
Right now, what is it possible to do here? Well, of course, in the first place, these ventures are bound to rely for their success on the receipt of advertising revenue. If they fail to get money for advertising, then these ventures will collapse. And that, of course, is why some time ago the Post Office put its point of view to the principal advertising associations, and they, in turn, represented the Post Office point of view to all the principal advertising firms throughout the country. And I certainly hope myself that the principal advertisers will have no track with these ventures.
President of the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, Brian McCabe.
The last communication we received from the Postmaster General was, in fact, last November concerning other pirate ships. And on that occasion, we passed his observations and his requests to all our members.
The major record companies were surprisingly quiet at this time, although there must have been some hurried board meetings to discuss this new threat to their empires. Phonographic Performances Limited talked of issuing writs for breach of copyright. But Harold Walter, general manager of the Performing Rights Society, didn't seem too worried.
In our daily business, we have to deal with a very large number of people whose liability to pay our fees is undoubted, but who do their best to evade us. It was therefore very refreshing indeed to find people, businessmen, whose legal liability was of the slimmest, who came forward voluntarily and said they wished to pay our fees. In short, from our point of view, they are very gentlemanly pirates.
The pirate ships seemed to be having an unexpectedly smooth passage. After their first engagement, they were still intact.
By this time, the Mi Amigo had reached Land's End. At 00:30 hours on the morning of April the 20th, a loud crack was heard, and the 140-foot mast, nearly as long as the ship itself, began to sway about dangerously. A shackle had snapped, and a mainstay holding the mast had become free. The mast looked as if it might come down at any moment and was swaying sufficiently to affect the steering of the ship. Captain Adowski was therefore forced to enter territorial waters and to anchor just off Falmouth until dawn. Nobody on board was sure what would happen to the Mi Amigo now that she had come within the 3-mile limit. To make things worse, a force-8 gale came up in the morning and the mast flipped about more viciously than ever. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Mi Amigo pulled up her anchor and entered Falmouth Harbour to repair her mast.
Where are you going? I'm feeling.
8 days later at the Waldorf Hotel in London, the Radio Atlanta Group proudly announced that the Mi Amigo had anchored 3.5 miles southeast of Frinton-on-Sea and not many miles from the Caroline. The two pirate ships were now in direct competition with each other.
But are the pirates that we see here in Britain merely frontmen of some bigger organizations? There's still some mystery about who supplies the financial backing for these 20th century buccaneers. To set up this kind of operation and still keep inside the law, you need to form a maze of different companies in numerous different countries: Panama, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Switzerland.
We find that we have to have this operation compartmented. By that I mean that the company with which I'm connected, the selling of the advertising time, has no direct or indirect connection with the other parts of the operation, that is the ship owner or the broadcaster, because under British law we must not have this connection.
Loot and pirates go together. But just how much loot do you need to launch a pirate radio ship and keep her afloat?
Yeah, there's about £250,000 basically involved in this thing.
Well, the owners of the vessel must have invested something in excess of £100,000. I don't know the figures, of course. That's their business. And we ourselves have a company of £150,000.
The one thing one must destroy any misconception anyone might have is that Radio Caroline is planned by some Mr. Big, you know, lurking in Central Europe with a big fat cigar and 100 greasy slaves, you know, putting this out as a kind of little thing there with a knob here and to make a big coup.
All the best things in life are free. You can give that to the bus and these I want money.
There'd been a lot of newspaper gossip about a possible Mr. Big. But as you've just heard Jocelyn Stevens explain, this exotically nonsensical figure never existed.
Your kissing gives me such a thrill.
But it still seems likely that a lot of money has been poured into these ships by various foreign businessmen. What made the real businessmen invest in such a perilously do-or-die venture? The dream their eyes are fixed on is no phantom ship. She lies just off Holland. Her name is Radio Veronica. She's the famous pirate radio ship, which after 4 years of skirmishing with the Dutch government finally made the pot of gold. It's reckoned that she receives over £1 million in advertising fees each year. At one time, it looked as if Radio Caroline and Radio Atlanta might survive like Veronica has, and like Veronica do very nicely for her backers. But the pirate life has suddenly started to get rough.
This is Radio Atlanta on our very first day, our Champers Day, bringing you brighter broadcasting and the finest sounds around. Miss Suzanne Scott.
Oh, let me go, let me go.
The major record companies are after the pirates' blood for using their discs. Radio Caroline defies the record companies by playing her discs direct from sea. Radio Atlanta by taping her programs on shore. World in Action was allowed to film this taping session only if we promised not to reveal where it took place.
I am a music publisher, and I have found that the effect of the BBC monopoly is unacceptable because it perpetuates the monopoly of the large record companies. And I'm afraid that to me a monopoly is something to be fought, not to be accepted. At the present time, there are only two outlets in sound broadcasting into England. One, of course, is the BBC, and the other is Luxembourg. Luxembourg is commercial, and the cream time of Luxembourg is held by all of the major record companies. The third and alternative outlet, such as a radio ship, arrives on the scene. It can be appreciated how very undesirable this would be from the major record companies' point of view because they cannot control it.
The major record companies agree with Mr. Crawford. They find it very undesirable. On Friday, May the 1st, they acted. The Queen office had a visitor. Notice of writs were served on almost everybody concerned with Radio Caroline for breach of the Copyright Act. Within the next few weeks, the pirates may well be fighting their first major battle here, in the High Court of Justice. But the second and more deadly salvo against the pirates was being loaded here. Roy Mason, MP.
From Parliament's point of view, this is a strong reason why these pirate radio ships must be outlawed completely. And that is, in our country, as we've allowed television and broadcasting to develop, and as we've allowed advertising on independent television, we have established a code of conduct, not only for programs, but particularly for advertisements. But the dangerous aspect of this is that they can advertise products that we ban on our television programs, drugs, pet pills, dangerous to young people. Now that is, in our opinion anyway, a very strong reason why these pirate ships should be outlawed.
The man who could really outlaw the pirates is the Postmaster General.
Some people think that we ought to turn a blind eye to this and allow these ventures to continue, hoping that they will provide a reasonable service of broadcasting for the public. But my own conjecture is that if the government acquiesced in what is happening, then we should soon find our shores ringed by an armada of pirate radio ships, with all the consequential dangers of which I've already spoken: interference with home programs and the risk to human life.
Today, Radio Atlanta made her first pirate broadcast. Today, the Council of Europe debated illegal broadcasts. Today, MPs and other top people who support commercial radio continue to press their claims. Today, in the Commons, the Postmaster General said he could not add to his earlier statements on possible legislation about the pirates. Whether or not the pirate ships will be silenced is still in doubt, but they certainly won't go down without their colors flying. They have at least proved that over 7 million people in Britain will listen to a program of continuous music. World in Action leaves you with a final salvo from each of the main contestants.
But let's be quite clear about this, of course. The pirates of 1964, like the pirates of old, are simply after money, as much money as they can get, and in defiance of international law.
The man from Whitehall who knows best is someone I really detest. You know, okay, 2 million people are wrong. This is bad for you.